But I do want to welcome you all to this space. You are in the Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity, which was previously the Center for Educational Pluralism, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But it's such an honor tonight to have all of you here, particularly for this 10th anniversary of the Journal for Educational Controversy, but mostly for our esteemed friend and colleague, Lorraine Casperson. Before we begin, I also want to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this area whose land we are occupying, and to thank all of the folks from Lummi Nation and Nooksack for letting us be here tonight. And in that, I want to just begin this welcoming by saying a few words about Lorraine Casperson.
Oh.
And I know this was not part of the plan.
I didn't see that in the program.
Well, this is when, we're going to take a little license here to just honor just say a few words about Lorraine. I want to start by saying that there's very few people that I know who like to be at the point of contention or conflict or controversy. And Lorraine takes on those challenges in a beautiful way, and has since she arrived on this campus 37 years ago. Yeah, 37 years. Now, I wasn't here 37 years ago. I was just a baby.
Don't
I
rub
was
it.
not a baby. But I'll let you think that. But what I want to say is that when Lorraine came here, and Evelyn is here as well, Lorraine and Evelyn were women faculty members. And at the time, there were so few women on this campus, and they were not treated as equals in their colleges, or on the university campus. And there were very few women who were faculty at that time. And so these two women really advocated for women's rights on this campus, and actually started a women's caucus. And for those of us who are here as students, staff, or faculty, we really owe a debt of gratitude to these women for fighting for us that we could be here. So thank you for that, because we stand on your shoulders now and are grateful. And, there's many things that Lorraine has done over the multiple years that she's been here to advocate for folks. And I just recently found out that Lorraine was part of a committee that organized to get compassionate leave for faculty and staff, which means that for folks on this campus who have family members who are sick or dying, that there's an opportunity for them to be able to leave the campus for short periods of time without penalty in order to take care of their families. And so, Lorraine, thank you for that again. I think when we think about the Journal for Educational Controversy, we think about issues of racial equity and justice that are at the forefront right now of our struggles. And there's been many struggles in terms of language, revitalization, immigration, and Lorraine has not been afraid to tackle those in our schools and on this campus. And I deeply admire her for that. And from a personal perspective, I want to share that when I came here in 2007, I was hired to be the director of the Center for Educational Pluralism. And at the time, I didn't know that the center, I didn't know the history of the center. And Lorraine was the history of this center. And prior to my coming, Lorraine had taken what the Center for Educational Pluralism at the time was really a small room, pretty much a closet, and it was provided because of we were out of compliance. The college was out of compliance in terms of meeting requirements for accreditation around diversity issues. And so there was a packet that students could read and take a multiple choice test, and they would get a certificate of completion saying that they had developed cultural competency. Now we giggle, right? That seems a bit silly, but at the time that was the first steps toward what we see here today. When Lorraine stepped in as the director of the CEP, things drastically changed. Lorraine created the conditions for students to empower themselves. So this space became a student-centered space. And she worked with students to develop a really incredible newsletter and brought keynote speakers like Jonathan Kozel, who is highlighted in the second journal. And she brought in community. One of the first events I came to was a community event where Lorraine worked with the Lummi Nation and artists to bring community members into this space that hadn't always been a welcoming space for Native peoples on their own land. So Lorraine, thank you for making SEED what it is today. So it has transformed from the Center for Educational Pluralism to the Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity. So we liked the seed, the seeds of social justice. We're in the basement here where the dirt and the soil is. We are sprouting into the rest of campus, well, the college, and to campus, right? So we are growing the seeds of justice. And so in closing, as an introduction, I asked Lorraine yesterday, I said, so what was it about, how is it that you decided to do the journal? What inspired you to do that? And Lorraine just looked at me like, this is the easiest question to answer ever. And she said it was to bring people in. And so I think that really just highlights Lorraine. Lorraine has always brought people in. And thank you, Lorraine, for bringing us all in here today. And this is such an honor and highlight for me and for all of us here to be able to be in your presence and to benefit from all the work that you've done on the journal and at this university for the 37 years you've been here. So thank you.
Okay. Well, that ruins all my notes. Thank you, Kristen. That's really so sweet of you. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Well, welcome to this is our 18th annual Educational Law and Social Justice Forum. And tonight we're celebrating the 10th year of the Journal of Educational Controversy. The journal actually started after the forums began. The forums began toward the late 1990s or so. And what we were trying to do was we found that the national dialogue that was going on in the newspapers about education and what the public was getting was quite frankly dismal. And what we wanted to do was to elevate that debate, to clarify it, to point out its moral significance. And so we started these forums for the university and also for the community. As a way of helping them understand the deeper issues in education. And so in 2006, when we started the journal, we thought, why don't we use the forums now as a way of bringing our authors to the forums to talk about the articles that they published in their most recent issue of the journal. And so since that time, that's how the forums have been functioning. And tonight, because it is our 10th year, can't believe it, of course, Kristen kind of rubbed it all in, so I'm beginning to feel it. Since it is our 10th year, I thought it might be a nice time to look over those 10 years and pick out 6 of the most controversial topics that we have covered and see where the authors are today and sort of bring us up to date on some of these issues. So tonight what we're going to be doing, we have 3 people here in person who will be talking about papers that they wrote and some of their more recent thinking. and they will be interacting with you as well. And then we wanted you to get a feeling for some of the authors who are across the nation. I don't have a budget to bring them to campus, and so we asked them to send a little 5-minute video that we might be able to show. So two of them came through for us. And what we're going to do is we're going to show one of the videos sort of in the beginning, and then we'll have our 3 speakers who are here in person talk and interact with you. And then we will then have the last video that we'll show toward the end. So that'll be sort of the format that we'll be using. Before we begin, though, I do want to just take one moment. You know, this is an occasion that I can use to really recognize and thank everybody who's made this possible. It does take a village. And if you look in your program on page 3, you'll see all of the people who helped make this really possible. Let me just point out a few people, if I might. I'd like to thank, of course, all of our administration. I see Dean Dade is here with us today, Dean Rios, all of the faculty and staff at Woodring. They have been behind all of this, and I so appreciate it. And of course, I so appreciate the work of Dr. Kristen French and all of the staff here at SEED. They have just been wonderful. They've done this every year for us, and they handle all the logistics, and it wouldn't be possible without them. So thank you so much. I see Dr. Vero Velez is here, has a wonderful program on social justice, and did a wonderful presentation for us when we had Curtis Acosta here, and I thank you, Vero. Let me also, there he is in the back, Greg Hoffenbacher. Greg has been our technology support for 10 years, and I often describe Greg as my panic button. When I run into trouble, I just press it, and there he is. There's Greg. Thank you, Greg. I appreciate all the 10 years you put into it. Now, some of you may have noticed that we have transferred to a new website this very year. We are now connected with Wilson, the wonderful people at Wilson Library, and they have migrated 10 volumes to the new website. The new website has a lot more functionality than the old website had. For example, if you want to know something about Bill's article after you listen to him tonight, I know you're going to want to know more about it. All you have to do is write in his name, and we have a search. It'll come up with all his articles and more about him. We didn't have that capacity before, so I just want to thank Wilson Library. I see Dean Mark Greenberg is here with us, and none of this would have been possible if he hadn't brought Cedar to Western, our new institutional repository. And by the way, Mark has a marvelous article in this recent issue of the Journal on open access publishing, which we're a part of. So take a look at it. It's a really good article. Thank you, Mark. Is Jenny Oline here? I don't know. She is our scholarly communications librarian. Now, Kim Marciak, Kim is right here. Kim is my second panic button. Kim did all of the transfer for us of, imagine 10 volumes, transferring it to the new website. So thank you so much, Kim. We also, of course, my editorial board, we have 22 people on our board. They're all over the nation, so I have to remotely thank them. But I see some of them here today. James Lockey is here. Rosalie Romano's here. Let's see, who else is here? Paul Engelsberg is here. I'm going to get to her. Laura Lafredo is here. Evelyn Wright is here. They're all our local people who are on our board. I left Chris to the end because Chris is another one, you know. Chris is our copy editor, and she has read every single, we published 220 articles. She has read all of them, and in minute detail, and worked with every author. And I have a list of accolades that people have sent that I could, it would make a whole column of praise. So, Chris, thank you. Thank you so much. We have some guest editors. We had several issues that were co-edited. One of our speakers, Dan Larner, co-edited come on up here, folks. Dan co-edited a special issue on the school-to-prison pipeline that we ran. And over here is Susan Donnelly. I managed to get Susan to co-edit 2 issues for us, and she was willing to do it. So thank you both so much. I so appreciate that. And finally, if you want to know when we talk about editorial staff, who's this editorial staff? There she is, my graduate assistant, Stephanie Fisher. Thank you. Okay, thank you for allowing me to take a little time to thank everyone because, come on in and take a seat, sure. Come on in, take a seat, folks. James, you want to come on and sit? Before I introduce our presenters tonight, I thought I would just take a moment to talk a little bit and share with you what the purpose of the journal was. And I'd like to point out 3 features and highlight 3 features of it. We like to distinguish between what we call surface controversies and in-depth controversies. There are many controversies in education. You know, if you're preparing to teach reading, should we use phonics? Should we use whole language? I mean, they still argue over these things. You know, what outcome should we have? How should we test it? I mean, all kinds of. The controversies that we're concerned with are the type that are much deeper. We're concerned about what it means to educate a public capable of sustaining a democracy. What does it mean to teach for democracy in an increasingly pluralistic, diverse society? There are many conflicts in that society, conflicts of interest, conflicts of principles. And those conflicts end up getting played out in the institutions like the schools. And so many of the conflicts that we find and many of the controversies that we find in the schools are actually deeply embedded in that larger public philosophy that makes up our society. So those are the types of controversies that we try to address. The second feature of the journal is the nature of the conflicts that we try to look at. They're not black and white conflicts, you know. Should I be just or should I be a tyrant? Well, actually, Plato had a lot to say about that, if you recall. But what we are looking at, really, are values and ideas where we don't want to give up either of them. We value something like freedom, liberty, the right to be able to express one's ideas. But we also value things like equality, equal opportunity for everyone. We don't want to give up either one. But in any particular case, those two sometimes come into conflict. And the way the journal is set up is that we have usually a theme for every issue, and then we construct a scenario, a real-life scenario, and we ask authors to respond to that scenario. So we don't ask them, you know, write an article talking about the conflict between equality and liberty. Now we give them a little kind of case study to think about. So in our very first issue, for example, we took this one from the courts. There was a case in Pennsylvania where a school district had passed an anti-harassment policy for the school district. Now, we understand the purpose of it. We believe in it. It's to help develop, promote a safe environment for everyone. It's trying to promote equal opportunity for everyone. But there was a parent of 2 children in the school district who was of a particular Christian persuasion. He was also, by the way, I think on the Pennsylvania State Board of Education. And he felt that he wanted to have the right to express his beliefs about homosexuality. And as a result, he felt that the Anti-Harassment Act that they had passed was so broad and so vague that it would silence all speech. And it would actually end up punishing his children if they tried to express their beliefs. Well, here you are. A concrete example where the 2 values we hold somehow come into conflict. So we presented that to our authors and said, okay, go at it. See how you're going to think through this issue. The judge, by the way, in that case was Samuel Alito. This was before he had actually been appointed to the United States Supreme Court. And Alito actually really struggled with the issue. He recognized what both sides were saying, and he had to come up with a decision, and it was rough. And a lot of the articles try to analyze how he thought through the issue. As a matter of fact, we have a lot of rejoinders for that issue. People just wouldn't let go of it, so they criticized this author, and the other author said, no, I'm going to criticize this one. So it's a great issue for a diverse group of thinkers. And by the way, I might make one other point. We don't take any position. Now the authors take positions, and they give you reasoned arguments for their positions. But our purpose is to bring that scholarship to bear on these questions and bring that analysis to bear on these questions, and then leave it to you to decide, okay, where do you stand now? Maybe the scholarship is helping you. Of course, the scholarship is going to be on all sides, so you're going to have to make a lot of decisions in terms of what position you're going to take. So that's the nature of the conflict that we're trying to develop in these volumes. One final feature of the journal, and then I'll stop. The journal is also conceived as a conversation over time. I don't like the journal. I don't want a journal that has, here's a bunch of articles, this volume, here's a bunch of articles for this volume. We want to sustain a conversation. And we do have that with our rejoinder section, of course. But we also have it in the way in which a question that's raised in one volume gets picked up in another volume and then picked up in a third. And you're going to see this tonight when you look at the very final video. The 2 authors wrote an article about the banning of the Mexican-American curriculum in Tucson, Arizona. Many of you are familiar with what happened there. And they decided to try to bring it up to date. So they wrote it for our 2015 issue. But actually, we started talking about that issue back in 2012. And we had an article written by, is it Augustine or Augustine? I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Augustine. Augustine Romero, who was the director of the program down in Arizona. And he wrote an article called The Hypocrisy of Racism, Arizona's Movement Towards State-Sanctioned Apartheid. And it's a really interesting article. He talks about the local politics that went on and gives you a vivid view of how these things get worked out. For example, that program, the Mexican American curriculum, had been going on since the late 90s. And then all of a sudden, I think it was 2000 and something, there was a speaker on campus. And the speaker made a statement, offhand statement. And the statement was, Republicans hate Latinos. Well, nobody in the audience at the time really paid much attention, but somebody did. All of a sudden, the newspapers got it. After that, the politicians got it. After that, it went to the legislature. And suddenly, the legislature is passing this particular law saying no school district shall have a class that promotes the overthrow of the United States government. Now, how did we get from that to this? No class shall promote resentment toward a race or a class of people. No class shall ever advocate ethnic solidarity instead of the treatment of pupils as individuals. Well, they passed this draconian law, and the superintendent actually did an audit. This was paid for by the superintendent himself, and the audit said, well, this program hasn't done any of this. The program is a perfect, as a matter of fact, it's meeting the needs of a population whose needs were not met, and they're doing great. But you know, watching the politics get worked through, no matter what the study said, it was just pushed aside, and the momentum just kept going and kept going until they banned the curriculum. They packed up the books, took them out of the classrooms, and so a year later we said, you know, this is still in the news. We ought to have a whole issue on it. So we ran a volume on the topic, who is the public in public education? Now, the Mexican American community is the public. They just happen to be the public that's being marginalized by other members of the public. But, you know, when we talk about the public, who are we talking about? And so we ran a whole issue on that. And we invited Curtis Acosta to join us. Now, are you familiar with Curtis Acosta's work? He was the teacher, one of the teachers in the school district. And he wrote an article. This was the title of his article, Dangerous Minds in Tucson, the Banning of Mexican American Studies and Critical Thinking in Arizona. And it's a marvelous, I really recommend you take a look at it. If you want to see what really went on in the classrooms in that school, he describes it in detail. And it's nothing like what they got in the media and in the newspapers and what the politicians were saying. And it's a very, very interesting article, and again in detail about his actual methodology. We invited him to the campus afterwards, and we do have an interview with him and a forum with him that's up on our journal's website, so you can see him in person if you want. So then the two writers that we're going to look at tonight said, you know, there's a gap in this literature, and I think we need to bring it up to 2015. So when you see the video, you'll see what they are addressing in this long conversation that went on about this topic over a number of volumes. So that's a third feature of our journal. So I invite you all to take a look at it if you haven't, and join the conversation. By the way, we have 2 graduate students who've published in the journal and 1 undergraduate who's published in the journal. So, okay, I will stop at this point, and from now on, we'll let the authors do the talking. Okay, we're going to show the first video.
Well, before we do that, we've got one more unscheduled moment in the program here. This is called the Journal of Educational Controversy, and it's been around for 10 years. It really should be called Lorraine's Journal for Educational Controversy. Lorraine conceived this and has made it go for the last 10 years in a really heroic way, and every issue shows her genius and tenacity, and she's done it against great odds, often not supported at all by the university. She's really done a heroic job. So the editorial board, all of the people here, we got together and we got some flowers that Kristen has there, and we created an award. We have the Distinguished Editor Award that we'd like to present to Lorraine. I want to read you what it says. The Distinguished Editor Award is hereby presented to Dr. Lorraine Casperson on the 10th anniversary of the founding of the Cutting Edge Journal of Educational Controversy, an interdisciplinary electronic journal of ideas. This award is presented by the editorial board to Dr. Casperson in honor and recognition of her leadership in the creation and editing of the Journal of Educational Controversy. The editorial board applauds Dr. Casperson's initiative, foresight, commitment, and tireless devotion to providing a national and international forum for examining the dilemmas and controversies that arise in the teaching and learning of citizens in a pluralistic, democratic society. So. Congratulations on 10 great years.
Thank you. I'm going to go home floating tonight. Thank you so much.
All right, now Lorraine gets to enjoy the rest of the evening. Bask in the wonderfulness of this. All right, so I'll be showing the film. And Lorraine, did you want to say a few words about the insert in the
I just wanted
program?
You'll notice in the program, there's a little questionnaire, and for every speaker and for every video, we're going to ask you, how do you want to extend this conversation? For example, the first little video we're going to look at is about a writer, an author who talks about religion and the public schools. What kinds of questions would you like to see addressed about religion and the public schools in a future issue? So we're going to ask you to help us define some of our future issues. And then toward the end, I'm going to ask all of you what kinds of controversies you've seen in your own classrooms, your school, in your practicums, in your student teaching. We might be able to make that a topic of a future issue. So we'd like you to help us define what those issues are going to be. If I might, here's something to think about as you watch this little video. Why is religion a problem for public education? We live in a very religiously diverse society. Can the schools be neutral? Should the schools be neutral? If the schools allow evolution in a science class, but deny intelligent design or creationism, are they being neutral? Should they be neutral? Can they be neutral? These are the questions I'd like you to ask yourself as you listen to his thoughts about those questions. Okay.
Hi, so I'm John Kovaleski, and from the University of Oklahoma. And the work I've been doing lately is largely on the question of moral formation of democratic citizens. I've been particularly interested in the struggles around radical incommensurable differences and the way these play out in public discourse, particularly where issues of religion, religious belief, and religious morality are involved. These seem to me particularly troublesome issues for us in a democratic society because they tend to be around issues that we're not willing to compromise on. One of the things that has struck me lately is becoming aware of the fact that our democratic process is largely built on the assumption that we will have conflicts about matters of interests, and we can compromise about those, and that those compromises will be shifting alliances on different issues. But when the issues are matters of principle religious belief, foundational commitments, it becomes very difficult to find ways to compromise. In fact, compromise becomes betrayal if you really believe that these are fundamental issues. Religion, in a certain way, seems to be the paradigm of that kind of case. And we seem to be struggling very greatly with how to bring that into the public square. The papers that I published in the Journal of Educational Controversy address these from questions of educational issues. How do we build a democratic citizenship that instills in students, fosters in future citizens, the ability to listen to people with whom they radically disagree in a way that allows everyone to feel heard, even while recognizing that not everyone's way is going to be able to be pursued. We sometimes present this as though the role of the public school particularly is to be neutral on matters of religion, and that's not possible in many cases. Those people who, for example, argue that evolution is just a theory and that creationism must be taught equally in the school, recognize that when the school teaches evolution as a scientific theory, the school isn't being neutral. The school is taking a side, as it must do. The educational question, it seems to me, becomes how do we construct a dialogue in which we recognize that neutrality is impossible. In many ways, a satisfactory compromise is impossible, precisely because there is no common ground. The starting points are different. And yet, at the end of the day, how do we get a decision-making process that recognizes the legitimacy and the full standing of all the citizens? And that becomes the other question. Oftentimes, in public discourse, we speak as though positions are ruled out of bounds merely because they're rooted in religious belief. And that means that some of our citizens come into the public square unable to speak their true beliefs behind the policies that they want. So we can argue, for example, that it would be a good thing to fund an adequate social safety net on the grounds that this will increase overall productivity and help the gross national product. And that may be true, but for people from certain religious traditions to advocate policies for the poor that help alleviate their poverty is not a matter of convenience or of contribution to the gross domestic product, but rather a commitment rooted in their faith beliefs that become trivialized when they're brought into the public square under other names. Anyhow, so in a variety of ways, I think we as a democratic society are facing a real serious matter of how we manage to build bridges across differences that are truly incommensurable and radically incommensurable, controversies about which there are no middle grounds, issues of abortion, issues of contraception, sexual morality, issues of even what seem like economic things like tax structures and progressivity versus flat tax. These are ultimately, in many cases, moral disputes that when we try and have those conversations in the language of secular advantages and disadvantages, economic advantages and disadvantages, we miss the real point of the disagreement. We weaken the democratic conversation. We thin out the notion of citizenship, and we make a satisfactory conclusion harder to come by because some of our citizens feel they are being told that their points of view not only aren't going to be the matter for policy, but simply don't count. That seems to me a dangerous place for our democratic life right now.
Okay, by the way, John wrote 3 articles in the journal, so I'll leave it to you to follow up and share with us some of your thoughts on extending this conversation. So let's go to our panelists who are here tonight, so you have an opportunity to interact more. By the way, on your program there is a bio for every one of the speakers, so I'm not going to read them, but I'll just introduce them. We have we're going to start with Professor Maria Timmons Flores from the elementary department, Professor Emeritus Dan Larner from Fairhaven, and Bill Line from the English department. And I thought what we would do is we'll start with Maria, and we'll go down this way, and I'll ask you for 10 minutes to just share some ideas, and then Kristen is going to entertain an interaction with the audience for 10 minutes, and then we'll move on to the second speaker. Okay, so that will be our way of handling it. Maria wrote an article for us on, the title was A Dream Deported, What Undocumented American Youth Need Their Schools to Understand. And she wrote that in 2013. And Maria, I just wanted to mention that I received an email 2 days ago from Teaching Tolerance, which is a magazine that's published by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they did a survey of 2,000 teachers between March 23rd and April 2nd of this year, and they wanted to know what the impact of the presidential campaign has been on the nation's schools. So the 2,000 teachers responded, and they said that there has been a profoundly negative impact on the school children. They talked about the alarming level of fear and anxiety that has arisen. They talk about the way in which racial and ethnic tensions have been inflamed. And this is some of their findings. They said more than 2/3 of the teachers reported that students, mainly immigrants, children of immigrants, and Muslims, have expressed concerns and fears about what might happen to them and their families after the election, especially about deportation. More than half of them have seen an increase in uncivil political discourse. Kids saying to other kids, "We're going to send you back after the election." More than a third have observed an increase in anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant sentiment, and more than 40% are hesitant of the teachers, are hesitant to even teach about the election. One school actually has a gag order and will not allow teachers to even bring up the election. And the teachers, in answering the survey, also had 5,000 comments. And they're really, really sad. Like, for example, in one school, this little kindergarten child kept coming to school every day and asking the teacher if the wall has been built yet. Teachers report that even native-born African-American children, with families who've been here since before the Revolution, the American Revolution, are afraid they're going to be sent back to Africa. Especially among very young children, there's a fear of a return to slavery. They're afraid they're going to be rounded up and put into camps. And it's a really interesting survey that to kind of get a feel for what this rhetoric is doing to the children in our classrooms. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, Marie, your paper is more relevant today than ever. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do is just revisit a little bit what the paper itself said as a foundation, because I don't know what people's background is in this particular area, but then also bring this back up, because as Lorraine said, not only is the political context today incredibly devastating to children and families, but it also, this has been a big week with the Supreme Court case that was read on Monday. So the timing of this could hardly be better. This paper was published as part of the series on the school to prison pipeline. And part of the thinking on that, and my part, was that families have gone back and forth over the, from Mexico to what is now the United States, back and forth since the border was at Colorado. So historically, a quarter of this country used to be Mexico before the Mexican-American War, and families have always moved back and forth. And up until very, very recently, the idea of movement in and out of this country was not seen as criminal. But with the militarization of the border and the criminalization of immigrants, it's taken on a totally different tone than it ever has before. We now talk about people as being illegal, which is a horribly demeaning term. So I would ask anybody, please interrupt that when you hear that term. The title of this paper, Undocumented American Youth, was used really intentionally because this paper really talks primarily about the dreamers who've come to this country as children and their families. But we have, current estimates are there are about 11 million people in this country without papers. Certainly they're from many, many different backgrounds. The largest group growing in that category right now are actually from Asia. There's a large Irish population still who are in that undocumented category. But probably the majority of folks I'm going to talk about today are really from Latin America, because that certainly is where the rhetoric is today that's really harmful. In the paper, the paper was published at a time where this had become a huge issue in terms of talking about undocumented youth. I wrote it because there was very little understanding that I found about educators who worked with children and families in schools. They didn't know the stories, they didn't know the issues, they didn't know the legal precedents, and they really didn't know what they could do, even if they did care deeply about the children in their schools. And so I really wrote this with both a lens to personalize and tell some of the stories of the students that I had worked with and I knew of, but also with a strong legal lens to it, because this area falls within a long tradition of civil rights legislation and laws. Any child in this country, regardless of immigration status, has a right to a free public education, regardless of their immigration status, regardless of their parents' immigration status. That's a long-standing Supreme Court case that's been on the books, and at the time that this has been written, there had been 164 anti-immigrant laws introduced across the country and passed that were undermining that right to a free, quality education for students up till 18. The thing is once you turn 18, you no longer have any right to an education or anything else. And so what we oftentimes saw was students who would be approaching that 18 years suddenly realizing they had no future. We don't know what the dropout rates are, but for Latinos in general across the country, and in many who fit this profile, learning English as a second language, oftentimes moving for work and being poor, the national rates are about 50%. If we're looking at children from undocumented backgrounds, it probably was much higher than that, because really as you start approaching it, what do you do when you turn 18? You no longer have a right to an education and really no rights at all. And you're facing a future that you really would live underground. So I think it was appropriate to put it in that journal article at the time and really cast it in terms of a criminal justice issue. And another important thing to think about is it's been over 10 years at the time this paper was published, probably 14 years at the time this paper was published, that they've been trying to pass the DREAM Act, which would create for those who come here as a child an opportunity for them to gain access to legal residency, a pathway to legal residency. It wouldn't happen overnight. But in order for them to be able to take advantage of that, all the laws say you have to graduate from high school and you have to be able to go on to higher education. So if you think about it, even our school systems underserving those children at least a dropout rate of 50%, that would eliminate even the opportunity for those should we pass that law. So at the time, there were about 12 million students and families without papers. There had been 164 anti-immigrant laws enacted in the 2 years previous to this, and we were spending $184 billion a year to detain, imprison immigrants, and that continues. So when we're talking about the criminalization and the school to prison pipeline, it's really, that's why it was situated in that issue. To bring us forward, just when this article was published, Obama had issued an executive order about deferred action for childhood arrivals. So the same category of dreamers, children who'd arrived as children, who've grown up in our public schools, who really had no opportunity to know their heritage, culture, language, family members, who'd really grown up here. He issued an executive order that would allow them a temporary deferment. It's no legal status, it's not permanent. And really the argument is that as a president, you have to direct, you have to make policy decisions. You know, this is terrible to know this, but we have enough money every year to deport about 4,000 immigrants, 400,000 immigrants, right? But there are 12 million in the country at the time. They're estimating 1 million now. At the time, he was deporting 1 million a year. So what do you do with that 400,000? As president, you say, okay, let's set some priorities, right? And let's say these folks are the lowest priority because these are the children who live in our neighborhoods. These are the children that most of us know. And so it was really an executive action about deferring and setting priorities about who would be deported. Of course, that's the legal status. What it really was a frustration probably with over 15 years of trying to do something about immigration and nothing happening, and realizing the trauma. You know, this paper was framed within the civil rights laws, the factor of chilling, disparity in terms of treatment of different kinds of people, and exposing people in terms of their status. That's the foundation there. If I were going to write this today, I would very much do it in terms of trauma. And the study that Lorraine cited is exactly that, the trauma that it causes to children and families. Imagine not knowing when you go to school every day if your parents are going to be there when they get home at night. You know, imagine your parent is late coming home or your partner is late coming home. And the ways of abusing this are incredible. You know, driving while Latino becomes a whole different concept when you get stopped and when you don't speak English, they call the Border Patrol to interpret for you. The number of people who aren't even given an immigration hearing, 83% of people who are deported are not even given an immigration hearing. So you can see there are many cracks in the wall in terms of this. But I would really frame that in terms of trauma. The time the paper was written, very few people had taken advantage of DACA, but immediately as that started going into effect, it had huge implications. Children who had dropped out of our public schools went back to school. Oh dear, I'll do it really quickly. Children who dropped out went back to school. People went on to higher education. States like the state of Washington made financial aid, state financial aid available to them. I directed an alternative route to teacher education program, and the conditional loan scholarship that supports that program no longer has a Social Security number on it. So the executive order has essentially created opportunities for people who choose to make a difference really to make that difference. So where we are now, Obama tried to expand that executive order to parents and to children. I'm going to take one more minute. To expand it. And that with that expansion, it would be largely for parents who had U.S.-born children, who are children born as U.S. citizens in this country. But just doing that, it raises the number of people eligible for those programs for deferred action, not amnesty, as some would call it, to 5 million. So 5 million people would have a temporary stay to that trauma they experience every day. You know, and so that was in the Supreme Court. That executive order was supposed to be enacted last fall. Texas, and along with 25 other states, is suing the Obama administration for that. That case was heard on Monday of this week. with a split Supreme Court, it definitely is a different decision. It all depends on who you listen to in terms of the news you select, what they think is going to happen out of that. And Texas's argument was this was an undue burden for them because they'd have to provide driver's licenses to these people. You know, heaven forbid that they could actually drive legally, get insurance, and pay taxes, which is really what the implications would mean for that. So that's before the courts right now. You know, I believe the courts are going to decide that that Obama clearly has discretionary ability to set policy. And I hope that I hope, thanks to largely the women justices on the Supreme Court, that they'll find some kind of compromise that keeps this open and available. Because really, I mean, the ability for us to deport 11 million immigrants is just, it's not possible. It's not possible. If people are here to stay, they're a part of this country. They're deeply woven. Even in that 5 million, the parents who would benefit from this have to have been here for 5 years, and most of them have been here for over 10 years. So they're deeply embedded in our communities, and they're not going anywhere. But I would say to educators, there are 2 take-home points, and I'll stop. One is learn from your students and your families, know what their rights are, stand with them, protect them, have your schools define policies ahead of time, and more than anything else, make sure that they get the quality of education that they're going to have when those legal policies go into practice. Because they're going to have graduated, they're going to have the ability to go on to higher education for the dreamers, be able to be successful. So as educators in the room, those are the things I'd ask you to think about.
Of course, the irony is that I'm doing the timekeeping, so for any of you who know anything about me, I know. So it kind of feels good to be on this end of it. So this is the opportunity for all of you to just take a moment and talk to the person next to you about what you're thinking about, what came up for you when you were listening to Maria speak about the article that she wrote. And then I'm only going to give you about a minute or 2 to discuss with a partner, and then we're going to come back with questions for Maria. We've got 10 minutes for questions and response. So 1 minute for you to discuss with each other, and then you get 9 with Maria.
What would you do if the next legislator you sit down with to try to convince them that we need immigration? What would you tell them? When you sit down,
Well, most of the ones I sit down with are state.
Republican.
Yeah, that's a losing battle. Look, I guess what I would try to do is convince them to reform election laws, or reform actually redistricting. I've learned one thing in all of this is that both sides draw these districts that are safe. And you have a Congress full of people who are elected by people who all think the same thing. And there's no incentive to make a deal, or to compromise, to bring together disparate points of view in order to get something.
Okay, this is your 1 second warning. I usually give at least a 1 minute warning. So if you could just wrap up your thoughts with your colleague.
There's just a convenient sound.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, that's for real. Okay, before you ask your questions of Maria, Maria has requested that she have the opportunity to say a few words about Dr. Casperson.
I just wanted to jump on the bandwagon of acknowledging Lorraine, because I was a student here 3 decades ago, and Lorraine was my teacher. I was a Huxley student who took a class in education, and really she was the one who made me understand that the politics of education and the place that schooling can be to take action in terms of justice issues. So I told Lorraine that when I arrived, and she said, "Oh, I don't remember you." It's like, well, that's okay. It's been 30 years with students who you've launched and inspired, hopefully on an entire career of really looking at justice in education. So I just had to have my minutes for that.
If there's anything, such thing as accomplishment, this is it. To be able to have students like Maria. Thank you.
Okay, now the floor is yours with Maria.
So you said there's 164 state laws that are like fighting the Supreme Court, saying that anyone who's here has a right to education.
So that when this was published, one of my motivations to publish this was that there was a great deal of anti-immigrant legislation that was going around. So at the time this was published, there were 160 laws that had been enacted in the 2 years prior to the publication of this. And if you don't know ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Commission, I guess ALEC, they essentially write legislation. They have a conference with policymakers and legislators, and they hand them legislation. So a lot of the anti-immigrant legislation, but in many, many different areas, you'll see the same, basically the same template presented state by state and state. So that's why you see this rise of different laws across different states that are tweaked just a little bit, because really in terms of a lot of the civil rights legislation, you undermine it chip by chip. You put a court case in, you might lose that, but you might figure out where the next one is. And that's partly what's happened around the immigration issues. You know, I tried to look up and see where are we now, how many of these, and I couldn't even find a recent stat on that. But the Supreme Court case that went before the Supreme Court on Monday, it was brought by Texas, but it's supported by 26 states who are really trying to stop the expansion of DACA and the expansion of DAPA.
And by ALEC and its donors.
Yeah.
And where does Washington?
Washington State is actually remarkably progressive in this issue. We definitely, we started with House Bill 1079 that allowed the Dreamers to go to school in Washington as residents of the state. That may not sound like it's a huge thing, but those of you who are out of state know the difference between in-state and out-of-state. And it's also allowed a gray area for people on this campus, really, to begin to support students without papers, to find ways to redirect different kinds of funding to support them. That was the first. But where we are now is that students in the state of Washington can apply for WAFSA, Washington State Financial Aid. So they can get that. They can also, it's still tough, quite honestly. I mean, scholarship season, all of you are students know what that's like anyway. But if you're a student without papers, with all the financial aid that's out there and available, it still isn't nearly enough. And if you think about it, no one in this category can work legally, right? So we're putting them in this impossible situation where just to live, and especially if they want to go on to school, they have to be working without papers.
Will you give me just one little example of what in ALEC's law, what a state is doing?
Well, the things that started in Arizona, the Show Me Your Papers law, definitely was the template that then moved to many other states. Georgia and Alabama have also been really, you know, I hate to call them leaders, but unfortunately they've been the pioneers with some of the ALEC legislation related to immigration. Georgia has banned students from higher education who don't have papers. Alabama has put in a law that has stopped, actually, thank you, put in a law that you would have to show, even in their public schools, K through 12, you would have to show documentation for the parents to enroll a child in school. When that law went into effect overnight, half of all Latino families quit going to school. And it didn't mean that half of all Latino families were undocumented or even a member of that, but it meant that there was that chilling effect that was so fearful of what would happen to students if they were so targeted that overnight half the students quit going to school. Luckily, that went to the courts, and there's an injunction on that one to stop that. And so, but those are the kinds of things, whether it's, stopping higher education, stopping public education, depriving people of driver's licenses, the ability just to racially profile and stop anyone who they believe is undocumented. Those are going across the country.
We have 2 more questions over here. We've got Karen and Dan.
Mine has to do with your response about, wanting to look at the trauma, the impact of trauma, and, because you do work that is so very local, addressing the very issues that we're talking about that have been studied and researched. In fact, this afternoon I had lunch with one of my mentees who's taking the migrant youth course, and she was telling me that she was just assigned to the Sterling Meadows Center. And I shared with her that about a year or so ago, we did some interviews with parents on what they would like to see for their children, and we couldn't even get beyond some of the interviews because the parents were talking about things like, there was one father there whose wife had just been deported, and he had 4 children, 2 of which were elementary school children, and 2 that were middle school. We had another parent who, because she had to be to work at 5:30 in the morning and having to leave her oldest child, who was 7, there alone, got the children taken away from her. So there were stories after stories after stories, and I wonder if we really realize just how local these issues are. Oftentimes we hear about these things, but we don't realize that we're facing and fighting these things right in our own neighborhoods, and I kind of say that for the students.
There's Color Lines has a policy paper called Shattered Families that addresses that exact issue, because immigration and our social services systems are different public systems, and so once you're in detention, you have no rights to participate in any kind of the hearings. And so about, at the time that was published, about 5,000 families a year lose custody of their children, and some of them permanently. So even though children have a parent who loves them deeply, because that parent gets caught up in the immigration system and they can't attend the hearings to keep them in the family, that they lose custody of them permanently. So yeah, it's heartbreaking, the intersection of how this plays out, across all of our different systems.
Dan?
Dean Dade told me something about what's going on locally, and that was my question, and you responded to it. So that's my concern, is the impact on children locally.
Yeah, and if you think about our area as a migrant community, largely, historically the farm workers in this area would move. As the immigration climate has gotten more and more difficult, they've tried to stay local because it's dangerous for them to travel. So it's a pretty significant percentage of our farm workers in this region who are undocumented. The other thing is that even, everyone knows someone in their family or in their community who's undocumented. So that's the traumatizing effect of it, really. Is that there's not anyone who's not touched by this issue, or the rhetoric, to have a presidential candidate refer to all Mexicans as rapists and thieves is just outrageous, and that becomes a rhetoric that's part of the public dialogue is really damaging. So it's a huge issue. And for me, I've learned a great deal because of the students that I've worked with who are undocumented, who I have to say are amazing people in terms of their own tenacity and resilience to continue to move, just with the hope that things will change one day. That it not only for their own benefits, but they've become activists and have continued to do this work. DACA has made a huge difference in their lives in terms of that. But one of the teachers that we supported in the alternative route is now certified as a teacher in the state of Washington. I think she's one of 4 teachers in the state of Washington that doesn't have papers. I was just speaking to her, and she's terrified because her DACA runs out next fall, right before the election. And so, you know, once again, you seem like no matter how far you go and how long you continue, sort of with that hope and dream that things are going to change, the dream can be deported anytime.
I know there are many more questions for Maria. Just in honor of the panelists that we have to hear from, I'd ask that you hold those thoughts, write those questions down on your sheet, and at the end of our time together, we'll have more time to talk as a community about all of these issues. So thank you so much, Maria, for this.
Yeah.
Lorraine?
Our next speaker is going to be Dan Lauder from Fairhaven. And Dan's article was Educating Politicians as Playwrights Toward a Sustainable World in Creative Conflict. We're kind of having this presidential motif running through, I think, our presentations. Dan wrote, in his article, he had, his very first line said, "If drama is the art of making the unseen visible, it is also the art of getting into the skin of another." And I was thinking about the way in which we are polarizing and dividing people in our society today, and treating it as us versus them, and trying to seeing the people as other than who we are. And you know, Dan raises the question: what does it really mean to really work through differences and be able to work towards some collective understanding? So, Dan, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Lorraine. I'll just start by saying that, making a comment about what we just heard. My involvement in my presumption in co-editing an issue on the school-to-prison pipeline, given the fact that my field is theater and film, comes from a 45-year involvement with the State Board of the ACLU of Washington. And I mention that only because legal cases came up so often in Maria's presentation. And if you go to the ACLU website, it's one of several that are extraordinarily useful. It's just aclu.org. And on it you will find a link to the wonderful website of the state organization, aclu-wa.org. And they have been major players in these issues, as well as many other civil liberties issues that are of concern to education, and probably to many of you. And that news it's a rich and wonderful resource. So I encourage you to take a look at it. Getting into the skin of others. The world of higher education has changed a great deal since I entered it. When most people believed, we've talked about beliefs here today too, and how they get so easily into conflict. Most people believed that education truly had its roots in discomfort. Bernard Shaw, the great British playwright who died in 1950, said, this is a line from one of his plays, Major Barbara. It says, when you learn something, it often feels at first as if you've lost something. And insofar as that's true, education is a really dangerous and upsetting enterprise. And I think that has its strong analogies at much lower levels of the process. I speak when I say lower only of age. I can remember being absolutely startled as a first grader by some of the things I was learning. I jumped once, and the teacher said, "Danny, what are you doing?" Because you were supposed to sit still, right? So, and my profession, as I say, theater and film, had me from the very beginning presuming that I could indeed, in some effective and important way, enter into the skin of another. That I could understand, it's a wonderful word in English. I think we're very fortunate to stand under something, to support it, to to hold it up. This is an extraordinary metaphor. When you, I mean, don't you have to get inside something to hold it up? Otherwise, the leverage is terrible, you know, and you're going to drop it. We have been through eras and are in a very difficult and complex one now, where difference is asserted as unenterable country. You will never understand me. You will never know what it's like for me. And I know how that's true. I don't know how it's true, obviously, for, you know, being male, trying to understand a woman, or for being very obviously white, trying to understand someone of color. But I do know what it's like to be in a religious minority. I do know what it's like to be an academic out in the community, where that is a description of something despised. I know what it's like to be seen as an artist in the business community. One of the institutions I've been affiliated with for many years is the Mount Baker Theater, trying to turn it into a community arts resource. And the idea that I would presume to write a business plan was laughable in some circles until they read it. So what prejudice is so multifarious, and as we all know now, resides in all of us in so many different ways. How do we undermine it? How do we teach politicians to talk to those very people who disagree with them most, and to do so productively? One of my thoughts was that we might try to use the discipline that I and my colleagues had practiced, disciplines. And I tend to think of this, I tend to think that if you can make things simple in some way, and it remains clear, and remains capable of complication, then there might be something to it. So I started to look at an art which I've always admired very deeply from a very early age, the art of ballet, and watch bodies who, even when I was two and three, I could not bend the way they do. I certainly didn't have the strength. I still do ballet exercises, believe it or not. Yeah, I'm sure you can tell from my lithe and flexible figure. And find them enormously useful. I'm much stronger than I was 10 years ago. The kind of basic fundamental idea of how to get yourself ready to move in the morning in ballet is a plie, a simple bending of the knees. But what comes after that is hugely complicated because it involves every single muscle of the body. And as you start to concentrate on them, you begin to reveal what a plie well done can do. It can strengthen, it can lengthen, it can teach you grace and beauty and smoothness of motion. It can teach you expressiveness. There are angry pliés, and there are other kinds. What's a plié for a playwright? What's a plié for a politician? Well, it seemed to me a good plié for a politician might be to begin the morning writing a scene. To be asked to say, you're going to talk to Joe. I want you to write a conversation between you and Joe, the very guy who tried to humiliate you on the floor of the House yesterday, in which you agree on a piece of legislation. Now, as a teacher, what I would do would think about that idea and try to break it down and make the scene much simpler. So the scene that I just mentioned is one that we get to after 4 or 5 weeks of work. But think of the implications. Suppose we trained politicians to accomplish what they accomplish by understanding. And that seemed to me to be a very significant challenge. How do we get there? And what are its curricular implications? I wrote that article that Lorraine mentioned, Educating Politicians as Playwrights, back in 2010. That's when it was published. It was first drafted in 2008. And I've been working ever since, going up and down like the stock market, trying to find ways to curricularize it. And most of the time failing, but occasionally, thank you, making progress. But what I think it's deeply implicated with is this idea of challenge and discomfort. When you're in a long position, the dancer tells you, when your body weight is off-center, that's when you have the most potential to lengthen and strengthen and acquire grace. When you're in someone else's skin, boy, are you lengthened, right? You are off-center. You are away from home base. And you have the challenge of having to keep touch with yourself at the same time. Try that out sometime and see how it feels. It may be, as ballet dancers say, a really good stretch.
I just want to acknowledge that that was 10 minutes. Leave it to our artist. I love it. Okay, another minute for you to discuss with one another, and then we'll have the rest of our time to ask questions. Dang, that was perfect.
It's like poetry.
For real.
Well, you know, timing isn't my thing. I just associate myself with you, so I look a little better.
I know, and when juxtaposed with me, everyone looks better, because time is food.
So you're notorious for going over the time that you allowed?
Well, I'm notorious for being late, again, because time is food, but
Time is fluid.
For me, it was always that I couldn't resist doing one more thing with whatever it was I was supposed to be doing before I was supposed to be at that meeting.
Exactly. There's just too much to do.
Okay, if you can come back, finish your last thoughts. Thank you. This is your opportunity to ask questions of Dan.
Yes.
I guess my question would be, how do you think we as teachers could best seek to understand 32 different perspectives 6 times a day, 5 days a week? Thank you.
Well, I've got a suggestion, believe it or not. I don't know how practical it is, but for me, the challenge, which was sometimes resisted by some of my students, sometimes really strongly, was number one, to invite the diversity in the room to come out, to give people the opportunity to talk about how they see this or do this or what their traditions are. And the other is to give the class the idea that we're listening because we could understand. Because we could understand. And here's a way to begin. Instead of saying, we can't understand. Difference is difference.
And then I guess a follow-up question to that would be, how do you create a kind of nurturing environment that's going to my perspective, this is where I come from. We're dealing with that right now, doing a poetry unit, so.
I'll bet you there are 25 people in this room that could answer that twice as vividly as I could. I don't have any magic recipe for that. And I was sometimes successful and sometimes wildly unsuccessful in my own classroom at giving people the impression that I appreciated their difference. Every quarter, I'd see in the comments on my teaching evaluations, Dr. Larner sees only himself, and anybody who's different doesn't count. And another comment saying, it's amazing how Dr. Larner accommodates everybody's views and appreciates where they come from. So, don't know what to say.
Devil's advocate question. Why focus on politicians who seem to be the least interested in changing their own perspective, or the least aware that they have something to learn that's different? I mean, if I could just paint the picture of someone who's going to be the hardest to bring to a different awareness, it would be a politician. Why not focus on the future politicians, the high school students, college students, kindergarten students, about pliés or mental pliés? Why did you pick politicians? I'm curious.
Well, it's a great question. I'm grateful for it. Because I think the article, if you read it, is focused. It's focused on education, which means leading out those people who are coming up. The other thing was I was motivated by the fact that the word politician nowadays has become a dirty word. And it seemed to me really important to rescue that word, among other things, because being a politician has got to be the most honorable thing any of us do. That's got to change. And it's got to become possible for us to see politicians as people who understand, as people who are willing to work through difference to solutions, and who are determined to do so, not determined simply to stand on some rock, which in the theater world is made of styrofoam, but to work out a solution, a path, to find a path, to mix metaphors, where everyone can walk. At least walk a little easier than they did before. So if we solve only half the deportation problem, we will have solved half of it. And we damn well better keep busy on the rest. But it's a hell of a lot better than not having solved it at all. So relieved a lot of misery. And that idea about compromise becomes as dirty as, everybody's faith gets violated. When there's no compromise, at least half of the people believe the world is falling apart. Well, we have a two-party system, so we're used to thinking that way, aren't we? A lot of people think the world is falling apart. It's not. It's alive there for us to improve it. And I think I would like to be a part of rescuing that notion and saving that word from permanent. I guess the word liberal has had a bit of a resuscitation, and all it means is free. So maybe the same thing can happen with the word politician. Thank you for the question.
Time for one more question.
I was just intrigued by the way you presented, and I told you, it's like we just experienced a little one action. She said, yes, it was a great soliloquy. But because I'm teaching social, cultural, and legal issues this quarter, some very wonderful students, we decided to look at things legally and social culturally at the same time. And one of the things I think that you bring to that is that oftentimes in conflict, it's the interests and beliefs that become the heralding process for debate. But when you bring in emotions and culture, then all of a sudden it takes on life. And so to me, that is to allow that into the conversation. I'm getting emotional talking about it, but to allow that is because so many times there's people say, well, I'm not going to bring up my religious belief in classrooms because I don't want to create controversy. And I'll have students who think for the rest of their life, well, she was or she wasn't, or and another person said, well, that just seems so inauthentic. Like, why can't we all be here as people, full people? And so it's so interesting to me because we're talking about the Pleiad, it's like, now let's dance. So in terms of creating that.
I think it should be an ambition in every kindergartner to talk with someone that he or she disagrees with. And that we're developing the ability to talk with people who we disagree with. We look forward to talking to people we disagree with. That's how you preserve democracy, to say, well, this is something I want to do, even though it's sometimes unpleasant. I mean, I wanted to raise children, and it was sometimes unpleasant. But it was sometimes so wonderful that I'm not sorry I've done it, and I'm still attached to them. So they haven't thrown me in the garbage can. So, and I hope we return also to that idea that education can be unsettling. It can be uncomfortable. And and respectful at the same time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, our last speaker is Bill Wine. And Bill wrote this article in 2008. And the theme of the issue was schooling as if democracy matters. And we wrote, let me just read you the first sentence in the scenario that we posed. We said, in this issue, we consider how we are to fulfill the traditional moral imperative of the schools to create a public capable of sustaining the life of a democracy. How do we do this in the age of the Patriot Act and similar anti-terrorism legislation? NSA surveillance, extraordinary rendition, preemptive wars, enemy combatants, and all of these are likely to involve violations of civil rights and civil liberties and a curtain of government secrecy. What story do we tell our young about who we are, who we have been, and who we are becoming? How do we educate our children about their identity in this global world? What sense are they to make of the imperial democracy they are inheriting? Well, Bill wrote an article called Beautiful Losers, in which he responded to that scenario by questioning the whole scenario. And he said, wait a minute, what do you mean the traditional moral imperative of the school? If you look at the historical realities of our nation, this has been going on since the very beginning. And so he wrote this really interesting piece that I used to use in my classrooms all the time. And I have to make one more comment, Bill. At the very end, Bill had this line. He says, if you give up hope, you can also then give up despair. Well, everything went fine until the students got to that line. And then, I mean, here I am teaching a group of very idealistic young people who want to go into teaching, and I'm telling them, you've got to give up hope. It's the only way you will give up despair. And So you present a lot of problems for me.
Thank you. I mean, one of the ironies of my taking issue with the controversy is that I helped write it. So it was not just issue with the controversy, but also issue with one of the essays that was in that issue also, that was written by Lorraine. Does a very good job of getting famous people to contribute essays to each journal, and the famous person in this one was Henry Giroux, who had a long essay talking about how we needed to take our schools back. He was sure that everything had changed since 1980, and it seemed to me that both the controversy and Giroux imagined some past golden time when schools really were this place about moral imperatives and democracy and things like that. It also seemed to imagine that the Patriot Act was unique, that we were living in the darkest of dark times, in the middle of the Bush-Cheney nightmare. And it turns out that the Congress of the United States has been passing alien and sedition acts and espionage acts and versions of the Patriot Act since about 1786. So the Patriot Act wasn't really something new and different that we were dealing with. And imagining some kind of golden age of schools, when they did the work that we all want them to do, seemed to me to be problematic too, given that public schools in this country and mandatory public, compulsory public schooling were invented in response basically to two things: to the rise of Catholic schools, when you had Protestant elites worried that school children were being educated toward an allegiance to the Pope rather than the president, and also after the passage of various kinds of child labor laws. You needed somewhere to warehouse the children of the working classes. It used to be you could send them off to a factory and make them work all day. As child labor laws passes, you now have a potentially revolutionary class of people that you have to ride herd on somewhere. And I think that's when you see laws for compulsory schooling come into effect. And I think it's also the roots of why many of our public schools, especially schools that are created for those in the neglected regions of capital, resemble those other great public institutions of warehousing, which are prisons. So it seemed to me that there was this kind of false optimism and false looking back to a kind of golden era that never existed. And in the essay, I talk a little bit about my own discipline, that in the English department, which seems fully anachronistic at this point, but English literature as a discipline was invented in the second half of the 19th century, primarily to convince, to create good little racist, misogynist citizens, to convince people that the canon of English literature from Beowulf to Virginia Woolf was the best that had been thought and said, and that was from God. And as you see the discipline that I teach in develop, especially in the later half of the 20th century, you can see how institutional imperatives come to crush any kind of impulse toward the moral imperatives that we were talking about in this controversy. So in the 1960s and 70s, in the wake of the GI Bill, in the wake of the women's movement, in the wake of the civil rights movement, is you have many more kinds of people going to college than had been allowed in before. You had a lot of people showing up to college saying, look, man, I can't read no more of this Beowulf or any more of this John Milton. Nobody here looks like me. Nobody here talks like me. And you get the literature version of the culture wars, what we called the canon wars, where things change dramatically, and the basis on which we make judgments about literature also changed dramatically. We understand literature in the larger political sphere rather than as something that's just from God. And we're treated to the canon wars in the 1980s and 1990s that generally have been won, but institutionally, the funding in English departments across the country has moved away from literature, where you can no longer count on the literature professors who grew up in the 60s and 70s to be committed to reproducing the good little racist, misogynist citizens that they're supposed to. Funding for literature programs has shrunken dramatically, and English departments are now funding technical writing and creative writing, where on the one hand you're educating employees, on the other hand you're educating self-involved aesthetes. And away from the kinds of insights and the kinds of questioning of the creation of culture that took place in the 1980s and 1990s. So I tried to set it up as saying, look, we're entering as teachers fundamentally rigged institutions that are in the. I actually quoted Luis Althusser's Chestnut about ideological state apparatuses and how schools and churches were the primary ideological state apparatuses, and then turned to talking about teaching within these institutions. And teaching over in the English department, we get a lot of Woodring students, a lot of future teachers. And many of them would come out of the kinds of classes I taught very, very energized about going to teach and seeing teaching as this romantic revolutionary activity. And for a long time, it was great to send them out. Many sort of freshly scrubbed young white people, with no disrespect to the freshly scrubbed white people here, but who would say, I want to be a teacher, and I'm going to go teach in the ghetto. I'm going to go teach in, and I'm going with a kind of missionary zeal out into schools where with pure hearts and genuinely good intentions, would leave and then would come back to visit me 2 or 3 years later saying, wow, this isn't what I expected at all. My job, I spend most of the time guarding the bus or calling people to say, why didn't your kids show up today? I feel like a jailer, and most of all, I feel really disillusioned because the students weren't buying, I brought them Paulo Freire, and they didn't say, my life has changed. Come back very disillusioned and would be, at best, disappointed in themselves, at worst, disappointed in their students, and saying, wow, maybe this stuff about poor people being poor because they deserve it is true. I mean, it would come back with the imperatives of the institution weighing down on them in a way that made them start to turn to what a political ideology that was frightening. In the essay, are you about to give me the hook here? Okay. In the essay, I try to make the point that the revolution will not take place in school, will not be because we as great teachers go out and change the world. And this is where the point about giving up hope becomes the thing. The presidency of Barack Obama, I think, is an excellent example. I mean, the main word that he brought to us was hope. A lot of people have been, anybody who looked at President Obama's record before he became president would have seen a centrist Democrat, but we were so sold on the idea of hope, and everybody has been so disappointed that those hopes have not been fulfilled. And that is the problem with hope. The flip side of hope is despair. And when you hope enough and you see that your hopes are not going to come true, the only place you get to go is despair. If you are committed to eradicating racism, to eradicating poverty, to generally making social change for the good, it seems to me that if you take anything like a clear-eyed look at the landscape that we actually live in, you must know that you are going to die a loser. You are going to die having not solved the problems you set out to solve. Okay, that is an inevitable truth. And thus, if you give up that hope, you have to find a new reason to get up in the morning. The dignity and honor of the work itself, and not the teleological end of it, has to be the reason why you get up in the morning, and that allows you to keep getting up in the morning in a way that despair doesn't. When you're 35 with a mortgage and you're saying, wow, none of my students like me, and the world isn't changing the way I thought it was going to because I read Paulo Freire, and you say, well, I must become a stockbroker now instead, or something. I mean, that's where despair leads you to. Yeah. No, I think the pliés come having given up hope. Yes. So in any event, that was the general argument, the give up hope thing that's caused Lorraine so many problems with her students. And I think that issue of the journal makes actually a nice precursor to the issue that we're going to be editing with Terry McMurtry Chubb about education and Black Lives Matter. The emergence of Black Lives Matter out of a long history of black resistance is calling into question, I think, institutions in the United States in a pretty formidable way. And I think here, especially, with the response that our campus has had to the threats that some of our students received last November, has become this sort of hopeless Rorschach test for the institution, in a way that I think probably, again, raises the question of, can an institution really do anything to undo institutional racism? And I think will force us to ask some questions about institutional racism that are, I think, harder than the ones 10 years ago, every undergraduate student knew to say race was socially constructed. And everybody knew to say that, and it was more and less useful sometimes. Now everybody knows to say that race is institutionalized. Racism is institutionalized. But what we're going to do with that, and the possibility that in an institution you are going to undo the racism that is at its fundamental bedrock, I think will be an interesting question that we can explore in the next issue of the journal.
Right, that issue is going to come out in 2017. So watch for it.
So let's dive into some wonderful. Thank you, Bill. And questions for Bill.
You're not going to give him a minute to talk about it?
We're on a leash here.
I think I need to do a plie in this paper.
Thank you all for your words. But Bill, would you say a little bit more about, and I know it's not necessarily on the point of your article, but I'm interested in the question of the post-World War II GI Bill and its influence on education, not just in literature, but more broadly. It sounds as though you've read the book that.
Well, look, I'm certainly not an expert on that, but it is, one of the great inventions, it seems to me, of the American 20th century that we're now losing. Yeah, please.
Maybe I'll clarify that.
Yeah.
I'm interested in its impact on Chicano studies programs, American Indian studies programs, African American studies.
Yeah, I think that all of those programs grow, or invented and grow, post 1955 or something. And in a kind of coalition with a variety of civil rights movements and the women's movement, and you have working class people of color, and women being admitted to college in numbers that are unprecedented. That increased dramatically, and it is the institution changes from the demands of those students. Okay, I mean that it's not anybody in the positions that we occupy who ever really drive change. Okay, it is the position, it is students who are showing up primarily looking for the resources and rewards that come with a college credential. Okay, I mean we often lose sight of the fact that this is an economic transaction that we're making here, and what we're giving people access to are a credential that gives you access to resources and rewards in the society. But it is from the demand of those students that Chicano studies, black studies, women's studies programs emerge. And in response to that, the kinds of funding choices that have been made by the state, in this state alone, half of our state support was cut in 2008. A lot of that has to do with, the economy's bad and things like that, but the state can always fund what it wants to fund. And I think what you see in the rearrangement of institutions, of colleges and universities, especially public colleges and universities since about 1980, is a reformation of that, because the college, the university, the English department, whatever department it might be, could no longer be counted on to do the work that it's supposed to do as an ideological state apparatus. And so that gets fought out within the institution, and you see the rearranging of the institution with the busting of faculty labor, where labor, faculty are now being deprofessionalized, turned into marauding bands of adjuncts, that can be fired at will. I mean, one of the great tragedies, I think, of the last 2 weeks was what happened in Wisconsin, where they've now busted tenure, where academic freedom has gone away. Universities generally are being rearranged to become more vocational, more directed toward the kinds of jobs that people are supposed to get. And ironically enough, the GI Bill was created to do exactly that, to train returning soldiers to go get some kind of manufacturing job in the society or something like that, some kind of job that needed a college degree. The beautiful thing about it was that those students transformed the universities in the 60s and 70s, and power is now redisciplining our universities in a way that we're back to just training employees. Please.
What happens, if you could conjecture for a moment, given what just happened in Wisconsin, what happens to such programs as, Black Studies, as Native American Studies, at Women's Studies programs? I mean, the University of Wisconsin at Madison was a flagship university filled with talented people. What happens now? Those programs are going to be radically underfunded. Are people afraid to teach them?
Well, no. I mean, look. I think in the extreme places like Arizona that Lorraine was talking about before, you see those programs being eliminated legislatively. But the disciplining of those programs took place in the 80s. I mean, Black Studies programs, Women's Studies programs, Chicano Studies programs began as genuinely activist locations that had genuine social justice kinds of things in mind. They get sort of academicized and disciplined in the 80s, where Black Studies moved so far away from any, the field that I'm most familiar with moved so far, became all about sort of French theory in the 1980s, and moved away from the hopes, dreams, and fears of the Black Power movement that was the real impetus for creating those programs. So look, I think those programs will continue to exist because they long ago stopped being a threat. I mean, in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education said we were supposed to have lots of lots of, sorry, Dan. Lots of our schools was supposed to be filled with black bodies. That hasn't happened. We still live among, in a wildly segregated society. One of the ways that we comfort ourselves is the space in classrooms that were earmarked for black bodies have been filled with black texts. And so we can all feel good about that. And so to some extent, Black Studies has come to play that role of assuaging the conscience of a society that didn't integrate the way it was supposed to.
How do you separate hope from purpose? Because when you said pretty much abandon all hope if you enter here, I just see it as a challenge. Like, I'm not going to be unhopeful. Cause, like,
Right on.
Yeah, exactly. But I feel like that is pragmatic if my hope is tied to my purpose as a teacher. I mean, I'm already grappling in my first quarter of Woodring if I even want to be a teacher, just facing the struggles I am. I'm like, I should have just gone into law enforcement.
No. I mean, look, I think that's a crucial distinction. Hope and purpose are two different things. I mean, hope, again, has this sort of teleological end. It is, I will reach that ship on the horizon, okay? You can still have purpose knowing you are never going to get to that ship on the horizon, okay? But you can still have purpose in the daily activities. I mean, exactly the kinds of things that I think Maria does every day. And the question that Karen had for her about what's happening here locally, what's happening with individual students. There are all kinds. I mean, I get this a lot. I mean, this doesn't mean that the world is just this horrible dark place where it doesn't matter what you do but if you imagine that you're going to give up the idea of this bucolic society where there is no racism anymore, you and I are going to die in a very racist world, okay? That doesn't mean that as an individual teacher with purpose that you can't do things that make differences in individual people's lives, okay? That change things. And I think that finding gratification and purpose in those daily kinds of activities is the thing that does keep you from not giving up and just becoming a cop. And whereas if 10 years from now you look up to the inevitable thing and say, the dream I had of changing the world isn't going to come true, so now I have to become a cop. That's a worse place to be, I think, than a place without hope.
As a non-English major, can I just suggest sort of an English grammatical answer to that? There's capital H hope and small h hope, and Bill's talking about maybe this capital H where I'm going to make this perfect society in the class, from the classroom. Maybe that's not attainable, but the small h hope that I can help that kid, in some ways today. I think that's maybe what you're talking about,
yeah,
purpose, but that's another kind of hope. So I think we shouldn't take what he's saying to think abandon all hope. Abandon this big capital letter.
Yeah. I think it was Derek Bell, who's a brilliant black scholar, who said that you have to simultaneously live with the realism that racism will always exist and the belief that your actions can make a difference. And I think that's really where it is. I mean, another person that's really inspired me a lot is Studs Terkel. And someone, when he was probably 93, asked him, God, in all the things that you do, how do you keep your sense of hope alive? And he said, well, what other choice do we have? You've got to live. To live is to hope. And that's what I'd say to you as a teacher. The actions you take every single day make a dramatic difference in the lives of your students. What you do does matter. And it also matters in the bigger picture. I love Dan's comment about politicians, because politicians are people who make policy. As teachers in your schools, your communities, you're going to make policy. So you can be a positive politician. You can make those changes in the interactions you make and the things you do every single day in your classroom, in your school, in your community to make a huge difference in the lives of the people. And it's like that granito de arena. You put a little bit in, and I think that's how you sustain it and keep going. And you do make a difference. I think teachers change lives, and I think we all have to do the work to make sure we're the kind of teachers who can change lives. But I do really think that's why I do what I do. So you'll make a difference. Thank God you're not in juvenile injustice system.
I'll give you a quick analogy. We never dreamed in the civil liberties movement that the society that we were working to improve would move so dramatically backwards in terms of its implementation of rights as it has in the last few decades. It's not that there weren't rank abuses back then, but they are more systematized and more enshrined in law than they were. And so it's possible to look at your work and say, we failed. And yet that's not at all what's happened. Size of the organization, it's 5 times larger than it was when I joined it. And far better funded, and does much more, has expanded from essentially a legal front to stand as a bulwark against the worst abuses, to an organization with huge public outreach and an educational arm, and lots of different ways in which to be effective. And God knows it's needed. The slogan back then turned out to be all too true. No battle for civil liberties ever stays won. Right? And it might be the same thing to be said for the battle for the heart of a child.
Well, you know, it's hard to believe, but we're over our time limit here. We had a rather tight schedule this evening. We do have one more video. I'm going to put that video. We are filming this, and we will have this on our website for the journal. I'm going to put that little video along with the filming we've been doing, so you can always take a look at it and think about. The video is, again, of the most recent article on the banning of the Mexican-American Studies program in Tucson, Arizona. Let me just, again, I apologize for kind of running out of time. I really appreciate if you would leave us your questionnaire, and especially fill out that back part where you talk about controversies you've seen in your own classroom, so that we can think about future topics for the journal. I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank all of you, and thank you for sharing our anniversary.
Before we leave this evening, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we have a birthday in the house this evening, that our very own Sierra Jackson, who will be graduating this year, who's been an extraordinary colleague to work with over the last 3 years. This is our last birthday in Seed with Sierra for her 22nd year, but it is the beginning of many years to come with her career, as she'll be graduating with a human services degree and doing the great work in our communities. So happy birthday, Sierra. And there's going to be another birthday next week, Lorraine Casperson. I'm not going.
Okay. Hi. My name is Leslie Locke. I'm from the University of Iowa.
And I'm Annie Blankenship. I'm at the University of Southern Mississippi.
And we've been invited to talk about our article in the Journal of Educational Controversy titled Keeping the Flames at Bay, the Interplay Between Federal Oversight and State Politics in Tucson's Mexican American Studies Program.
So we wanted to start with what originally inspired us to write this piece. And it kind of goes back to when I was a doctoral student at the University of Georgia and was invited to a screening of a documentary called Precious Knowledge about the kind of the rise and the fall of the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson, Arizona. And I was particularly moved by the documentary and enraged at the situation, and did some work on the issue during my doctoral program. Made her watch the documentary, and she was, I believe, as inspired and enraged by the situation, and that led us to kind of a joint exploration into what the current status was and how we could be more academically involved with the situation.
Yes, I agree, Annie. So Annie joined me at USM, and I had been there, I think, a year or two before you had gotten there, Annie. And my research area and my interests lie in broadly in the marginalization of students from underrepresented groups in the K-12 school system. And my dissertation work and much of my master's work as well was looking at those issues, particularly for Latino students. So I had quite a bit of background knowledge on barriers in the K-12 system for Latino students in particular. Yet I had not seen Precious Knowledge or heard about the controversies going on in Tucson. And so when Annie said, hey, you should watch this video, I brought it home, and I just was sort of floored, embarrassed, shocked that I hadn't heard of it. So that was problematic on multiple fronts. And second, that the sort of the controversy behind and the forces supporting the pushback against the Mexican American Studies program and ethnic studies in Tucson was a real sort of kind of started a fire in me, and I really wanted to know more. And so we got together and decided that we wanted to write about this. We didn't know kind of where we wanted to go or where it would end up. So we started digging through the literature quite a bit, and came across the articles, the couple of articles that are in the Journal of Educational Controversy, as well as the recorded interviews with Curtis Acosta and I believe the director of Precious Knowledge. So we were really inspired to gain that sort of, understand that sort of personal experience and history with the program, in addition to the other academic scholarship that has come about as a result of what's happening with the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson.
One thing we noticed in the literature, both at JEC and from other outlets, was that one part of the story was kind of missing from the dialogue. There was so much great troubling of the critical race issue that was going on with the students' protest and the actual culturally relevant pedagogical issues and political issues. But what was missing from the discussion was the role of the federal courts in the entire issue. So Tucson is one of a pretty big, unfortunately, a pretty big handful of school districts that are still under federal court order as a result of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954, as a result of a court case filed in the 70s in Tucson. So the federal court actually played a big role in protecting the Mexican American Studies program, and there was a short time period in which the federal court granted Tucson unitary status, which means the court determined that they had met their burden of getting rid of the vestiges, this is the legal languages, of de jure or legal segregation. So that happened at the district court level in, I believe, 2009. So it kind of opened this window for more freedom on the part of the Arizona lawmakers to come in and make changes to this Mexican American Studies program, which had been proven wildly effective in serving a community that was specifically targeted for intervention in the unitary status fight. So this window opened, and the case was ultimately appealed, and the Court of Appeals disagreed with the district court and sent it right back, and then they were again under district court supervision and remain so until potentially 2017. They're expected to be released in 2017 if they comply with the terms of their current preliminary unitary status plan. Of course, that can always change, but that legal window allowed for some game playing on the political side that really changed it changed the conversation in Tucson and in Arizona generally.
Yes, and so that was the piece that we saw missing in the literature. That piece is this story about what happened in this window of time, and particularly how it was allowed to happen was because of this lifting of the unitary status plan from, I'm sorry, is that the right language, Annie? Unitary status plan? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So lifting of the order basically from the federal government, and the state was allowed then to come in and create all of this controversy, get all of this movement behind them in terms of their ideas about what this program was doing, mm-hmm. And then ultimately pass HB 2281 and have the program ultimately deemed
anti-American.
Yes, thank you. Anti-American, and that it was going up against American values and norms and such, which is clearly absurd. But anyway, it was this could happen because of that sort of window of opportunity. So now the unitary status plan. There's another window coming up in 2017, and so while there a culturally relevant teaching and curriculum have been reinstituted in Tucson, clearly they're vulnerable, right? So we need to be really cognizant and pay attention to what's going on in terms of that federal oversight, because we know what happens once it's lifted. Right. I don't think that we can trust the conservative sort of politicos in Arizona to understand or do what's best, what has been obviously clearly established as a quality curriculum that is impacting positively the achievement of students and their college going rates. So I can't stress enough that it's really important to pay attention to what's going on in terms of these policies that sometimes kind of fly under the radar. We don't pay much attention to them, but they're very powerful in terms of what can actually happen on the ground in schools.
And this struggle between the idea of quote unquote colorblind policies and more culturally conscious curricular decisions is happening not just in Tucson, but all over the country in various ways, shapes, and forms. We've seen it in Mississippi, in the Macomb School District, not far from the University of Southern Mississippi. We know some of that is going on in Chicago. Through some general research, there are things going on in Alaska and Hawaii with Native populations. So certainly this is on the consciousness of many communities, and there are implications for using this argument that no, we're trying to provide colorblind policy or colorblind curricular opportunities when it's really just a cover for we're going to offer the same old white supremacy curriculum that we've offered throughout history. And those groups, particularly the neoliberal conservative groups that are in power right now, being threatened by the idea of having students of color presented with alternative versions of history in which they are heroes. That appears to be very threatening to the establishment. And I think we're going to be seeing more of this as we move forward, and as students of color become a bigger and bigger majority. The narrative of history has to change.
Right.
So we're going to continue to see this struggle as we move forward.
Correct. Right. I think probably one of the most compelling pieces that came out of the paper, and this resulted, I think, basically on our own understanding of the processes that were involved in the implementation of the desegregation order in Tucson all the way through to 2015 when we wrote the paper. But it's very confusing. So there are many different policies and many different actions going on, not just within the district, but within the state and within the country. So we actually started out by just writing these things down on paper and trying to figure out, okay, what happened when? And so we ended up with the help of a fantastic graduate assistant with creating a figure sort of detailing how we got from 1969 and 1970 all the way down to 2015 in terms of specifically what went on in Tucson in terms of creating ethnic studies and ultimately forces combining to eliminate the Mexican American Studies program, and then what has been sort of reincarnated. I won't say reinstated because there's something different there now, but a reincarnated, culturally relevant curricula and teaching going on in USD currently. So if you don't want to read the whole paper, a sort of quick, great figure is included in the paper as well, and that kind of will give you a snapshot of the various numerous different pieces of legislation and actions at the federal, state, and local levels in terms of this program. So